Sylvan Ridge, Idaho, rested in the arms of nature's serenity, its rolling hills blanketed in soft greenery, with fields of wheat swaying gently in the wind. The valley, framed by dense pine forests and crowned by distant snow-capped mountains, was home to a close-knit farming community. Life moved slowly here, unburdened by the chaos of the outside world. Neighbors exchanged greetings at the lone general store, children played by the creek, and farmers tended their crops from dawn till dusk. It was a place untouched by the shadows of crime until the morning of March 16, 2023, when the peace was shattered. Thaddius Cole, a 37-year-old farmer known for his reserved demeanor, placed a call to 911. His voice, calm and measured, carried the chilling news. He reported that his wife, Marabel, had gone missing. According to Thaddius, she had left their farmhouse the previous evening to gather herbs and wildflowers in the nearby woods, but had not returned. His account painted a picture of concern, but something in his tone felt off to those who knew him. The community sprang into action. Word of Marabel's disappearance spread quickly, and within hours, neighbors gathered with flashlights, ropes, and search dogs. Sylvan Ridge had always been a place where people cared for one another, and the idea that someone among them could vanish without a trace was unthinkable. Belinda March, a retired botanist who lived down the road, organized search teams, coordinating the effort with local law enforcement. Despite their determination, the first day of searching yielded nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of Marabel. For many in the community, the situation was bewildering. Marabel was well known for her warmth and kindness. She was an accomplished craftswoman whose embroidery was the pride of Sylvan Ridge, often showcased at the local farmers market. She had a radiant smile and a talent for making those around her feel valued. Her sudden disappearance felt deeply wrong, as if the valley itself mourned her absence. Thaddius, on the other hand, seemed detached. He joined the search parties but kept to himself, often wandering away from the group to comb the fields alone. His stoic nature was well known. Many attributed it to his autism, which caused him to struggle with expressing emotions in socially typical ways. Still, his lack of urgency unnerved some. Belinda noticed how he avoided direct eye contact and rarely mentioned Marabel's name during the search. In the days leading up to her disappearance, there had been little indication of trouble. To outsiders, Thaddius and Marabel appeared to have a stable, if unremarkable, life. They lived in a modest farmhouse at the edge of the valley, surrounded by fields. They worked together. Yet those closest to the couple knew that cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. Marabel had confided in her brother, Corwin Ellison, about her growing frustration with Thaddius's rigidity and their mounting financial struggles. She had recently hinted at wanting to leave Sylvan Ridge, hoping to start over in the city. It was a dream she had kept private, fearing Thaddius's reaction. As the search stretched into the evening, the mood in Sylvan Ridge grew heavy. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the valley. Lanterns illuminated the woods, but each step into the undergrowth seemed to lead nowhere. The forest, once a place of beauty and quiet refuge, now felt ominous, a labyrinth that swallowed clues and kept its secrets well guarded. Detective Phineas Drake arrived at the scene the following morning. A seasoned investigator, Drake had seen his share of missing persons cases, but something about Marabel's disappearance struck him as unusual. He observed Thaddius from a distance, noting his composure and the lack of visible distress. The community's sorrow was palpable, yet the man who had reported his wife missing seemed oddly removed from it. Drake resolved to learn more, aware that appearances in cases like this were often deceiving. Sylvan Ridge, once a sanctuary of peace, now found itself under a cloud of suspicion and fear. The search continued, but beneath the surface, quiet questions lingered. Could Marabel have wandered too far and become lost in the wilderness, or was there something far darker at play? The tranquility of the valley had been broken, and its residents could feel it. The Hayes farmhouse stood as a quiet sentinel at the edge of Sylvan Ridge, its faded red paint and weathered wooden beams a testament to decades of life etched into its walls. For years, this house had been a home for two seemingly ordinary people, Thaddius Cole and his wife, Marabel. But as investigators began to piece together the story behind Marabel's disappearance, the layers of their life started to unravel, revealing tensions that no one in the tight-knit community had imagined. Marabel Cole was known in Sylvan Ridge as a beacon of warmth and resilience. She had a talent for turning the simplest moments into something memorable. On Sunday mornings, she could often be found at the local quilting circle, sharing stories with neighbors while her fingers worked deftly on vibrant, intricate patterns. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and dropped off baked goods to new families moving into the valley. But beneath her gentle exterior, Marabel had dreams that reached far beyond the quiet boundaries of Sylvan Ridge. Marabel's friends noted subtle changes in her demeanor during the months leading up to her disappearance. Belinda March, her neighbor and confidant, remembered their last tea gathering with a sense of unease. Marabel had been uncharacteristically quiet, her eyes drifting to the window as if searching for an escape. When pressed, she admitted feeling trapped, though she didn't elaborate. "Sometimes I think about what life could be like in the city," she said softly. Those words lingered with Belinda after Marabel vanished. Her brother, Corwin Ellison, shared a closer perspective. As a wildlife researcher, Corwin often traveled between towns but made a point to visit Marabel whenever he could. During their last conversation, Marabel revealed she had been considering leaving Thaddius. "I'm not sure how much longer I can live like this," she had confided. She described Thaddius as increasingly controlling, his routines becoming more rigid, and his temper flaring over minor issues. Yet Marabel also expressed guilt, torn between her own happiness and her responsibility to support Thaddius. Thaddius Cole was a man defined by structure. Diagnosed with high-functioning autism as a child, he thrived on predictability. His day began at sunrise, feeding the chickens before heading to the fields. Marabel often joked that Thaddius could set the clock by his habits. While his routines brought order to his life, they also left little room for flexibility, a trait that became a source of tension in their marriage. In the community, Thaddius was regarded as a reliable, albeit distant figure. He rarely attended social gatherings, preferring the solitude of the farm. Neighbors respected his work ethic but knew little about the man himself. Some whispered that his stoicism bordered on coldness, but few questioned it outright. After all, Thaddius had always been Thaddius, reserved, methodical, and quiet. However, Marabel's disappearance cast his behavior in a new light. Detective Phineas Drake began to notice patterns that raised questions. For one, Thaddius seemed reluctant to discuss Marabel in any meaningful way, deflecting questions with vague answers. When asked about their relationship, he described it as normal, but offered no specific examples. His lack of detail stood in stark contrast to the outpouring of stories from neighbors about Marabel's vibrant presence. The Hayes farmhouse itself became a focal point in the investigation. From the outside, it looked no different than any other home in Sylvan Ridge, a modest structure with a small garden out front and a barn in the back. But inside, detectives found subtle signs of disarray. In the kitchen, they noticed a missing chair at the dining table. When asked, Thaddius claimed it had broken and was discarded weeks ago, but no one could recall seeing him haul it away. The floorboards near the back door bore faint scratches, as if something heavy had been dragged across them. Luminol testing later revealed faint traces of blood, barely visible to the naked eye. Forensic analysts would later confirm it was human blood. Reconstructing Marabel's final hours proved to be a challenge. Thaddius maintained that she had left the house to gather herbs near the woods, a common activity for her. He claimed she had been in good spirits, even humming a tune as she grabbed her basket and stepped outside. She said she'd be back by sundown, he told Detective Drake. But when pressed for details, Thaddius's story began to falter. He couldn't recall what Marabel had been wearing that day, a detail that most husbands would likely remember. He also seemed uncertain about the exact time she left, estimating mid-afternoon but providing no corroborating evidence. Investigators began to suspect that Thaddius was withholding information, whether intentionally or due to the stress of the situation. As word of Marabel's disappearance spread, neighbors began to share their observations. Belinda March recalled hearing raised voices from the Hayes property on the evening of March 15th, followed by a loud, sharp sound. She assumed it was Thaddius working with tools, as he often did after dark, but the timing now seemed suspicious. Another neighbor, Jonas Harper, mentioned seeing Thaddius near the edge of the woods early the next morning, dragging what appeared to be a tarp or heavy fabric. When asked why he hadn't reported it sooner, Jonas admitted he hadn't thought much of it at the time. "Thaddius is always moving things around the farm," he explained. These accounts, though circumstantial, added to the growing sense that something sinister had occurred at the Hayes farm. The serene image of Sylvan Ridge was beginning to crack, revealing darker undercurrents that no one had anticipated. Detective Drake knew that building a case against Thaddius would require more than intuition. While the blood traces and witness accounts pointed to foul play, there was no direct evidence tying Thaddius to a crime. Yet the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit too neatly. The scratches on the floor, the inconsistencies in Thaddius's story, and the chilling sense of detachment in his demeanor. As the search for Marabel continued, Drake turned his focus inward, toward the farmhouse, the fields, and the woods that bordered the property. Somewhere in this quiet corner of Sylvan Ridge, the truth lay buried, and Drake was determined to uncover it. The night of March 15th, 2023, brought a sense of unease to the Hayes farmhouse. The day had been uneventful on the surface, but tensions between Thaddius and Marabel simmered beneath the mundane chores of farm life. Their relationship, already strained, reached a breaking point when Marabel broached the subject of selling part of the farmland, a suggestion that Thaddius vehemently opposed. For him, the land represented stability and order, the two constants in his otherwise rigid world. For Marabel, it was a chance to escape. The argument began in the kitchen. Marabel had been preparing a simple dinner of roasted vegetables, her hands working quickly as she spoke of their debts and her desire for change. Thaddius, sitting at the table, barely looked up. He dismissed her concerns, insisting they could manage as they always had. But Marabel, tired of his refusal to listen, pressed harder. She spoke of wanting to leave Sylvan Ridge, to start over in the city where she could pursue her craft and find a life beyond the confines of the farm. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Thaddius froze, his mind struggling to process the sudden upheaval of his routine. For a man who thrived on predictability, the prospect of Marabel leaving was unthinkable. His response was swift and emotional, a rare display for someone so controlled. He accused her of abandoning him, of disregarding everything they had built together. Marabel countered with her own frustrations, her voice rising as she described the loneliness and suffocation she felt in their marriage. The argument spilled out of the house and into the yard, where the chill of the evening air did little to cool their tempers. Marabel's voice carried into the darkness, a sharp contrast to Thaddius's low, clipped tones. Neighbors later reported hearing the commotion but assumed it was a typical marital spat. What happened next, however, was anything but ordinary. In a fit of rage, Thaddius grabbed the nearest tool, a heavy hoe leaning against the barn wall. Marabel, startled by his sudden movement, took a step back, but it was too late. The blow was quick and decisive, striking her on the side of the head. She collapsed instantly, her body crumpling to the ground as silence fell over the farm. Thaddius stood frozen, the hoe still in his hands. His mind raced, alternating between disbelief and a desperate need to restore order. For a moment, he considered calling for help, but the implications of what he had done stopped him. Instead, his instinct for control took over. He decided to hide what had happened, convinced he could cover his tracks and return to his structured life. He dragged Marabel's body across the yard, the weight of her lifeless form making the task slow and arduous. The moonlight illuminated the trail he left behind, faint marks in the soil that would later become critical evidence. At the edge of the woods, Thaddius began to dig. The ground was hard and unforgiving, but he worked methodically, the physical labor grounding him in a way his thoughts could not. When the grave was deep enough, he placed Marabel's body inside, carefully covering her with soil and leaves. He stood over the makeshift burial site for a moment, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The night was still, the sounds of the forest seeming louder in the absence of her voice. Back at the farmhouse, Thaddius set to work erasing any traces of what had occurred. He wiped down the kitchen counters, scrubbed the floorboards near the back door, and discarded the blood-stained cloths in the barn's incinerator. Yet despite his meticulous efforts, small remnants of his crime remained. A faint smear of blood missed under the table, the scratches on the floor where he had dragged her body, and the disturbed patch of soil near the barn. By the time the first light of dawn broke over Sylvan Ridge, Thaddius had constructed his story. He would report Marabel missing, claiming she had gone to gather herbs and failed to return. It was a simple explanation, one he believed would hold up under scrutiny. He rehearsed the details in his mind, ensuring his account would sound plausible. But as he walked back into the house, the reality of his actions began to settle in. The silence was deafening, the absence of Marabel's presence more noticeable than he had anticipated. He avoided the kitchen, where their argument had started, and instead sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from him. As the morning unfolded, Thaddius placed the call to 911, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. The operator asked him to describe the situation, and he recited the story he had practiced, careful not to deviate from the script. When the search teams arrived later that day, he joined them, his demeanor calm and cooperative. Yet the weight of what he had done lingered, a quiet shadow that followed him through the fields and forests. The crime had been committed, the body hidden, and the scene cleaned. But as meticulous as Thaddius was, he had overlooked one crucial detail. The truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it is buried. The search for Marabel continued to expand, drawing in both the local sheriff's department and volunteers from neighboring towns. Helicopters scanned the woods from above while search dogs combed the ground, their handlers tirelessly calling Marabel's name. News of her disappearance had reached the state police, and media outlets began broadcasting the story of the beloved Sylvan Ridge resident who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Detective Phineas Drake, however, was less convinced by the narrative that Marabel had simply gotten lost. In his years of experience, he had seen too many cases where the surface explanation unraveled upon closer scrutiny. Something about Thaddius Cole's demeanor gnawed at him. It wasn't just the lack of emotion, it was the precision of his answers. They felt rehearsed, almost too perfect, as though he had prepared a script to explain away any suspicion. The first break in the case came when forensic teams examined the farmhouse. The faint blood smear beneath the kitchen table caught their attention. It was small, easily overlooked by an untrained eye, but it contradicted Thaddius's claim that Marabel had left the house unharmed. Additional luminol testing revealed faint drag marks leading from the kitchen to the back door. While not definitive, the evidence hinted at foul play. Drake interviewed Thaddius the following afternoon. Sitting in the modest living room of the farmhouse, he observed the man closely. Thaddius sat stiffly in an armchair, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on a point just above Drake's shoulder. The detective began with casual questions, asking about Marabel's habits, their daily routines, and the last time he had seen her. Thaddius answered calmly, sticking to his story about her leaving to gather herbs. But as Drake shifted the focus to their relationship, the cracks began to show. Thaddius hesitated when asked about their last argument, his gaze briefly flickering to the kitchen. "We didn't argue," he said flatly, though his clenched jaw betrayed his unease. Drake pressed further, noting that neighbors had reported hearing raised voices the night before. Thaddius dismissed the claims, attributing the noise to the farm animals. It was a weak excuse, and Drake knew it. The tension in the room deepened when Drake mentioned the blood smear. Thaddius's face remained impassive, but his hands tightened into fists. "I don't know how that got there," he said, his tone defensive. Drake let the statement hang in the air, giving Thaddius enough rope to reveal more. "Maybe she cut herself cooking," he added after a pause, though the explanation felt hollow. Meanwhile, a new witness came forward, Jonas Harper, the neighbor who had seen Thaddius near the woods. In his statement, Jonas described watching Thaddius drag what appeared to be a heavy tarp toward the tree line early in the morning. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Jonas admitted, "but now I'm not so sure." When shown a map of the area, Jonas pinpointed the approximate location where he had seen Thaddius, giving investigators a critical lead. The search dogs were deployed to the area Jonas had described. Within hours, they alerted their handlers to a specific patch of disturbed soil near a grove of oak trees. The officers who arrived at the scene worked quickly, removing layers of earth until they uncovered what they had feared, a shallow grave. Marabel's body was found wrapped in a floral-patterned sheet, her head bearing the unmistakable blunt force trauma of a deadly strike. The discovery confirmed Drake's suspicions, but it also raised new questions. The presence of the sheet suggested a moment of hesitation, perhaps even remorse on Thaddius's part. It was an inconsistency in an otherwise calculated act. Drake knew that unraveling this detail could provide insight into Thaddius's state of mind during and after the crime. When confronted with the discovery of the body, Thaddius maintained his innocence. He claimed ignorance, insisting that someone else must have placed Marabel there to frame him. "I didn't do this," he said repeatedly, his voice shaking for the first time. But the evidence was mounting against him. Soil samples taken from the soles of his boots matched the composition of the gravesite. Furthermore, an imprint of the hose blade found near the barn matched the wound on Marabel's skull. The most damning evidence came from Belinda March, who remembered seeing the floral-patterned sheet hanging on the Hayes clothesline the week before Marabel's disappearance. "That's Marabel's favorite one," Belinda said tearfully during her interview with detectives. She'd never let anyone take it outside without a good reason. Drake's suspicions grew into certainty as he pieced together the timeline. The drag marks in the kitchen, the tarp in the woods, the grave, it all pointed back to Thaddius. But as the evidence stacked up, the motive remained elusive. Why had a seemingly mild-mannered man turned to such brutality? And why had he gone to such lengths to cover it up while maintaining a facade of normalcy? The final piece of the puzzle came when Drake reviewed Marabel's phone records. Text messages to her brother Corwin revealed her plans to leave Sylvan Ridge and start anew. "I'm going to tell him tomorrow," she had written the day before her death. "It's time for me to live my own life." The message, timestamped just hours before her murder, gave Drake the clarity he needed. Thaddius had acted out of desperation, unable to face the prospect of losing Marabel and the fragile stability she represented in his world. As the investigation closed in, Thaddius's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became withdrawn, retreating to his farmhouse and avoiding the search teams that still combed the area for additional evidence. Drake decided it was time to confront him directly, armed with the weight of the truth and the determination to bring justice to Marabel. Detective Phineas Drake knew from experience that the truth often lay buried beneath layers of deception, and in the case of Marabel Cole's disappearance, every detail mattered. The evidence recovered thus far, the blood smear, the disturbed soil, and the hoe, pointed firmly to Thaddius Cole. But for the case to hold up in court, Drake needed more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. He needed to establish intent, connect the physical evidence definitively to Thaddius, and uncover the deeper dynamics that had led to this violent act. The forensic team provided their preliminary findings. The soil samples taken from Thaddius's boots matched the gravesite perfectly. Even more damning, the handle of the hoe bore microscopic traces of Marabel's blood, confirming it as the murder weapon. But the discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation was a fingerprint, a partial but identifiable print of Thaddius's thumb, pressed into the sheet that had been used to wrap Marabel's body. Drake had his killer, but questions about the motive still lingered. Drake began a methodical review of Marabel's personal life, starting with her communications. Her phone and laptop revealed fragments of a woman yearning for freedom. Emails to her brother, Corwin Ellison, spoke of her frustrations with Thaddius's unyielding routines and his growing temper. "It's not the life I dreamed of," she had written just weeks before her death. Her text messages told a similar story. She had been planning to leave, but with Thaddius's unpredictable nature, she feared his reaction. "I have to tread carefully," she wrote in her final text to Corwin. "I don't want this to end badly." This revelation gave Drake a critical insight. Marabel's decision to leave was the likely catalyst for the crime. Thaddius, a man whose life revolved around structure and routine, would have seen her departure as a catastrophic disruption. For someone like him, whose autism heightened his sensitivity to change, Marabel's plan could have triggered an overwhelming emotional response. Drake turned his attention to the farmhouse itself. The creaking wooden floors and weathered walls seemed to hold secrets of their own. Forensic teams revisited the scene, paying close attention to areas that had been overlooked in the initial sweep. In the barn, they discovered a pile of ash in the incinerator. Sifting through it, they recovered metal buttons and a scorched fragment of fabric consistent with Marabel's clothing. The evidence suggested that Thaddius had attempted to destroy items that could tie him to the crime, but his efforts had been incomplete. The search of the farmhouse also yielded a small notebook tucked inside a drawer in the kitchen. Its pages were filled with Thaddius's meticulous handwriting, notes about crop rotations, expenses, and to-do lists. But toward the back of the notebook, Drake found something chilling, a list of items needed to prepare. It included a tarp, gloves, and cleaning supplies. The list was undated, but its implications were clear. This wasn't an impulsive act. Thaddius had planned for this moment. Interviews with neighbors added to the mounting evidence. Belinda March recalled a conversation with Marabel a few weeks before her death. "She told me she felt suffocated," Belinda said. "She wanted to leave, but she didn't think Thaddius would let her go." Jonas Harper's account of seeing Thaddius dragging a tarp toward the woods became even more significant when paired with these insights. The image of a man desperate to hide his crime began to take shape. Drake decided it was time to confront Thaddius directly. Armed with the evidence, he visited the farmhouse accompanied by 2 officers. Thaddius opened the door, his expression unreadable. Drake could sense the tension in the air as he explained the purpose of his visit. "We've found Marabel," he said simply, watching for a reaction. Thaddius's face twitched, but he said nothing, stepping aside to let them in. In the living room, Drake laid out the evidence piece by piece. He started with the soil samples, then moved to the blood smear and the fingerprints. Finally, he presented the forensic analysis of the hoe and the items recovered from the incinerator. "The evidence is clear, Thaddius," Drake said, his voice firm but calm. "Marabel didn't just disappear, she was murdered, and we have every reason to believe you're responsible." Thaddius's composure began to crack. His hands trembled, and he avoided Drake's gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered, his voice barely audible. It was the first hint of a confession, but Drake knew he needed more. "Then tell me what did happen," he urged, leaning forward. "Help me understand." What followed was a fragmented, disjointed account of the night in question. Thaddius admitted to the argument, describing how Marabel's decision to leave had pushed him over the edge. He claimed he hadn't intended to kill her, that the blow with the hoe had been a moment of blind rage. "I panicked," he said, his voice shaking. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I hit her, it would all go away." Drake listened carefully, noting the inconsistencies in Thaddius's story. While the confession confirmed many of the details investigators had pieced together, it also raised new questions. Thaddius portrayed himself as a man overcome by emotion, yet the evidence of planning, the list in the notebook, the use of the incinerator, suggested premeditation. Drake suspected Thaddius was downplaying his culpability in an attempt to gain sympathy. As Thaddius was taken into custody, the weight of the case settled over Sylvan Ridge. The tight-knit community, once defined by its tranquility, now found itself grappling with the darkness that had festered in its midst. For Marabel's family, the discovery of her body brought a sense of closure, but also deepened their grief. Corwin Ellison vowed to ensure that his sister's story would not be forgotten, channeling his pain into advocacy for victims of domestic violence. For Detective Drake, the case was far from over. The confession, while significant, was only one step in securing justice for Marabel. As he prepared to build the prosecution's case, he reflected on the fragility of human connections and the devastating consequences of broken trust. The truth had been unearthed, but its weight would linger in Sylvan Ridge for years to come. Detective Phineas Drake knew the case against Thaddius Cole was far from airtight. While the confession provided a critical turning point, its inconsistencies raised troubling questions. Was Thaddius minimizing his intent, or was there more to the story than even he was willing to admit? Drake needed every piece of evidence to fit, not just for a conviction, but for justice to be served for Marabel. The forensic team continued their meticulous examination of the farmhouse and its surroundings. A breakthrough came when they expanded their search to a small storage shed near the edge of the property. Hidden beneath a tarp in the corner of the shed was a collection of tools, including a second hoe. This one had no visible blood, but bore faint traces of soil consistent with the area around Marabel's shallow grave. The placement of the tool and its condition suggested it had been recently cleaned, a detail that deepened suspicions of deliberate concealment. The shed also yielded another critical clue: a pair of muddy boots tucked behind a stack of hay bales. Soil embedded in the soles matched samples from the gravesite, reinforcing the link between Thaddius and the location where Marabel's body had been found. Additionally, a faint smudge of what appeared to be blood on the toe of one boot was sent for analysis. While evidence mounted against Thaddius, Drake turned his attention to the people who knew him best. He revisited the neighbors, pressing them for details they might have overlooked or dismissed. Belinda March, always eager to help, mentioned an odd encounter with Thaddius the morning after Marabel's disappearance. "He came by asking if I had any extra bleach," she recalled. "Said he needed it to clean out the barn." At the time, it hadn't struck her as unusual. Farmers often use bleach for cleaning. But in hindsight, the request seemed suspicious. Drake also revisited Jonas Harper, the neighbor who had seen Thaddius dragging the tarp. Jonas admitted he had initially downplayed what he'd seen out of fear of becoming involved. But when Drake pressed him, Jonas provided more detail. "It wasn't just the tarp," he said reluctantly. "There was something heavy inside it. I thought maybe it was an animal carcass, but now I'm not so sure." These revelations added layers to the case, painting a picture of Thaddius's actions in the hours after Marabel's death. The bleach request, the cleaned hoe, and the concealed tools all pointed to a calculated effort to hide the crime. But Drake still needed to understand why Thaddius, A man defined by routine and order would act with such violence and deception. The turning point came during a detailed analysis of the Hayes farmhouse. Forensic technicians discovered a small USB drive hidden in a drawer in the kitchen. Its contents revealed a series of recorded video diaries, entries made by Marabel in the weeks leading up to her death. In the videos, she spoke candidly about her growing fears and frustrations. "Thaddius has been more unpredictable lately," she said in one entry, her voice tinged with worry. "He gets angry over the smallest things. I'm starting to feel like I'm walking on eggshells." One particular entry, recorded just days before her murder, sent chills down Drake's spine. "I think he knows I'm planning to leave," Marabel said, her expression a mix of determination and dread. "I've been careful, but he watches everything I do. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." The video diaries not only provided insight into Marabel's state of mind, but also directly contradicted Thaddius's claims of a peaceful relationship. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in a volatile marriage, her attempts to escape thwarted by her husband's possessiveness. Armed with this new evidence, Drake prepared for a second interrogation of Thaddius. The goal this time was to dismantle his narrative and force him to confront the inconsistencies in his story. In the sterile confines of the interview room, Thaddius maintained his stoic demeanor, but Drake noticed the tension in his posture and the way his hands fidgeted against the table. Drake began by presenting the physical evidence: the cleaned hoe, the muddy boots, and the bleach request. Thaddius dismissed each item with rehearsed explanations. "I needed the bleach for cleaning," he said flatly. "The boots were dirty from working the fields, that's all." Then Drake introduced the video diaries. As he described Marabel's recorded words, Thaddius's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped to the table. "She didn't understand," he muttered. "She was going to leave me. I couldn't let her do that." This was the moment Drake had been waiting for. He pressed harder, asking why Thaddius hadn't sought help or tried to talk things through. "You had options," Drake said, his voice firm but calm, "but instead you chose violence. Why?" Thaddius's response was chilling in its simplicity. "Because if I couldn't have her, no one could." With that admission, the room fell silent. Drake's mind raced as he processed the significance of Thaddius's words. They confirmed what he had long suspected. The murder was not a moment of blind rage, but a calculated act born of possessiveness and control. The confession, combined with the physical evidence and Marabel's video diaries, created a compelling case. But for Drake, the work was far from over. He needed to ensure that every piece of the puzzle was airtight, that no detail could be exploited by Thaddius's defense. Justice for Marabel required nothing less. As Drake left the interrogation room, he felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. The truth had been uncovered, but its cost was immeasurable. Marabel's voice, captured in those haunting video diaries, would stay with him long after the case was closed, a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked control. The confession from Thaddius Cole was a significant breakthrough, but Detective Phineas Drake knew that securing a conviction required more than admissions of guilt. Defense attorneys were skilled at twisting narratives, and Drake needed to ensure that every piece of evidence was ironclad. Marabel's death deserved justice, and her story deserved to be told without ambiguity. The process of building the prosecution's case began with a comprehensive timeline of events. Drake and his team reconstructed the days leading up to Marabel's disappearance, cross-referencing witness statements, forensic evidence, and Thaddius's own words. The contradictions in Thaddius's story became increasingly evident. He claimed Marabel left the house willingly, yet the blood smear in the kitchen suggested otherwise. He insisted he panicked after her death, but the methodical burial and attempts to destroy evidence pointed to premeditation. The district attorney, Linda Grayson, reviewed the case with a sharp eye. Grayson was known for her tenacity in the courtroom and her ability to present even the most complex cases in a clear and compelling way. "This case hinges on proving intent," she said during a strategy meeting with Drake and the forensic team. "The jury needs to see not just what he did, but why he did it." To bolster the case, Grayson focused on the psychological elements. Marabel's video diaries were a centerpiece of the narrative, painting a vivid picture of her fear and Thaddius's escalating behavior. "These videos are her voice," Grayson explained. "They show the jury who she was and what she endured." The prosecution's case also relied heavily on forensic science. soil analysis, blood spatter patterns, and the trajectory of the hoe's impact were presented in painstaking detail. Expert witnesses testified about the cleaning products found in the shed and the incinerated fabric, linking them directly to the cover-up. The fingerprint on the sheet and the matched soil samples from Thaddius's boots were the linchpins that tied him to the crime scene. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with spectators from Sylvan Ridge and beyond. The community, once defined by its quiet rural charm, had become the center of a high-profile case. Reporters jostled for seats, their cameras capturing the tense atmosphere as Thaddius was led into the courtroom. His stoic demeanor remained, but those who knew him best saw the cracks in his facade. The defense, led by attorney Gerald Stanton, attempted to paint Thaddius as a man overwhelmed by his circumstances. Stanton argued that Thaddius's autism made him incapable of premeditating such a crime, and that Marabel's death was a tragic accident. He highlighted Thaddius's consistent routines and the stress of losing control over his life, portraying him as a man pushed to his limits rather than a cold-blooded killer. But the prosecution countered with precision. Grayson called Marabel's brother, Corwin Ellison, to the stand. Corwin's testimony about Marabel's fears and her plans to leave added emotional weight to the case. She wanted freedom, he said, his voice cracking. She wanted to live, and he took that from her. Belinda March also testified, recounting the bleach request and the muffled argument she heard the night of Marabel's death. Her words painted a chilling picture of the events leading up to the crime, reinforcing the narrative of a controlling husband desperate to maintain power. The most damning moment came when forensic analyst Dr. Naomi Carter took the stand. Her testimony about the physical evidence, the blood smear, the soil samples, and the trajectory of the fatal blow left little room for doubt. Using diagrams and models, she demonstrated how the hoe was wielded with deliberate force, contradicting Thaddius's claims of a spontaneous accident. Throughout the trial, Drake watched as the jury absorbed the evidence. He could see their reactions to the video diaries, their shock at the forensic findings, and their sympathy for Marabel's family. But he also knew that juries could be unpredictable. The defense's emphasis on Thaddius's mental state and his perceived lack of intent could sway some to believe in a lesser charge. The prosecution's closing arguments tied everything together. Grayson stood before the jury, her voice steady and resolute. "This was not an accident," she declared. "This was the deliberate act of a man who refused to let go, who saw Marabel not as a partner, but as something he could control. The evidence is clear, and the truth is undeniable." The defense's closing was equally impassioned, pleading for understanding and leniency. Stanton emphasized Thaddius's struggle with autism and the emotional toll of Marabel's departure. "This is a tragedy," he said, "but it is not murder." After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury began their deliberations. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as hours turned into days. Drake, sitting quietly at the back of the room, replayed every detail of the investigation in his mind. Had they done enough? Had they presented the truth in a way that couldn't be denied? Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson's voice rang out, steady and clear. "We find the defendant, Thaddius Cole, guilty of second-degree murder." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Marabel's family embraced, their tears a mix of relief and sorrow. Thaddius sat motionless, his expression unreadable as the weight of the verdict settled over him. For Drake, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the loss of Marabel could never be undone. As the proceedings concluded, Drake stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The case had taken its toll, but it had also reaffirmed his commitment to uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Marabel's story would not be forgotten, and neither would the lessons it carried about control, freedom, and the enduring quest for justice. The courtroom's echoes faded, but the impact of the trial lingered long after the verdict. Thaddius Cole's conviction for second-degree murder brought closure to the case, but for the residents of Sylvan Ridge, the scars ran deep. The once tranquil valley was forever marked by the tragedy, a reminder that even in the most serene places, darkness can take root. Marabel's family, while relieved by the outcome, struggled to reconcile their grief with the finality of justice. Her brother, Corwin Ellison, became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, using his sister's story as a rallying cry for change. "Marabel's life mattered," he said at a public forum a year later. "Her dreams, her fears, her voice, they mattered, And we can't let her story end here. Detective Phineas Drake reflected on the case with a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The evidence had been clear, the trial fair, and the verdict just. But the weight of Marabel's death and the unraveling of a life so full of potential stayed with him. As he reviewed his notes for the final time, he couldn't help but think of the small, mundane details. Her love for gardening, her skill with weaving patterns, her laughter echoing in the farmhouse before it all fell apart. Drake's investigation had revealed truths not just about Thaddius's crime, but about the broader human condition. The case highlighted the devastating effects of isolation control and unchecked emotional turmoil. Thaddius Cole's autism and rigid routines were not excuses, but they provided context for understanding how his fear of losing stability turned into violence. His story was a tragic example of how unaddressed mental health issues could spiral into destruction. Marabel's courage, though, became a symbol of resilience. Her video diaries and her decision to seek freedom inspired many who heard her story. Women in Sylvan Ridge and beyond began to speak out about their own struggles, breaking the silence that so often traps victims in cycles of fear and control. Local organizations saw a surge in requests for support and counseling, a testament to the power of Marabel's voice, even in death. For Sylvan Ridge, the case brought a reckoning. The community grappled with its complicity in overlooking signs of distress. Neighbors who had heard arguments or noticed odd behavior wrestled with guilt, asking themselves if they could have intervened sooner. Belinda March, in particular, became an outspoken advocate for community awareness. "We can't just mind our own business when something seems wrong," she said in a town hall meeting. "We owe it to each other to pay attention." Thaddius's sentencing hearing brought a final moment of reflection. Standing before the court, he apologized in a monotone voice, his words rehearsed but not entirely insincere. "I didn't want this to happen," he said. "I didn't know how to handle it. I wish I could undo it all." His sentence, 40 years in prison, ensured he would spend the rest of his life grappling with the consequences of his actions. In the months following the trial, Drake received a letter from Corwin. It was brief but heartfelt, thanking him for his dedication to uncovering the truth. "You gave Marabel her voice back," it read. "You gave us a chance to heal." For Drake, it was a reminder of why he pursued justice in the first place, not for the accolades or the closure, but for the people left behind, those who must find a way to carry on. As the seasons changed, Sylvan Ridge began to heal. The farmhouse, once a place of pain, was sold to a young family eager to start fresh. Marabel's garden, though untended, began to bloom again, a quiet testament to her enduring spirit. The oak grove where her body had been found became a site of remembrance, with a small plaque installed in her honor. It read simply, "In memory of Marabel Cole, may her story guide us toward compassion, understanding, and justice." The case of Marabel Cole offered lessons that extended far beyond Sylvan Ridge. It reminded everyone of the importance of listening, to the quiet struggles of loved ones, to the cries for help that often go unnoticed. It underscored the value of mental health support and community intervention, showing how small actions could prevent tragedies. Most importantly, it emphasized that justice is not just about punishment, but about acknowledging the humanity of both victims and perpetrators. Detective Drake, as he closed the case file for the last time, thought about Marabel's final video diary. "I just want to be free," she had said. Her words stayed with him, a call to action for everyone who heard them. Freedom, he realized, was not just the absence of control, but the presence of choice, respect, and love. Marabel had sought that freedom, and though her life was cut short, her story ensured that her pursuit of it would inspire others for years to come. In the quiet of his office, Drake looked out over the rolling hills of Sylvan Ridge, now bathed in the golden light of dusk. Justice had been served, but the work of healing and learning continued. Marabel's legacy, he knew, would endure, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon of hope and resilience in the face of darkness. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.